Welcome to Glad You Asked. I'm glad you joined us for this edition. Today we'll be talking about the question, how should I handle criticism? So as a pastor, you can imagine I face plenty of criticism. Everybody knows how to do my job better than I know how to do my job. But then again, everybody knows how to do your job better than you know how to do it as well. And so we are all in the situation where we might be criticized, and especially if you're in leadership. Leadership by its nature has an occupational hazard, and that is criticism. And so I want to encourage you today, if you've been criticized, there's some ways that we can handle criticism that will help us as we navigate those difficult times that we face with people who love to share their opinions about the things that we say or don't say, the things we do or don't do. And so maybe this will help you. Now, you would think that if you were perfect, that would allow you to rise above all criticism. But the reality of it, that is when we look at Jesus, who was perfect in all his ways, he was probably as criticized as much as anyone who's ever walked on the face of the earth. I mean, if you read through the Gospels, you discover that Jesus was criticized because they felt like he was breaking the law. He was criticized because he was hanging out with friends of sinners and sinners themselves and tax collectors. And so people were always criticizing Jesus, even though he went about doing good. And so as we think about criticism, it's not about being perfect, because perfect doesn't cause you to be above it. But we know, even as we are imperfect people and we're flawed people, that we're going to get criticized. Just due to the fact that you're not perfect means that sometimes you'll do things wrong. You'll say the wrong thing, so therefore you're going to have to endure criticism. Even when you're right, sometimes you're going to have to endure criticism. So when we do get criticized, what are some things that the scriptures teach to help us as we try to deal with these things on a regular basis in our life? So let's take a look at Proverbs chapter 15, and this will be verses 31 and 32. Here's what it says. The ear that listens to life-giving reproof will dwell among the wise. So a person who listens to people when they reprove them can grow in wisdom. It says, whoever ignores instruction despises himself, but he who listens to reproof gains his intelligence. And so when I read this text, I think there's two questions that I come away with. That when we get criticized, that we should evaluate the content of the criticism. We tend to take any kind of criticism very emotionally, but if you take it just from the standpoint of reason and you look at whatever the critic is saying to you, there's a lot to be gained as you look at the criticism. So there's two questions that I try to ask whenever I get criticized. The first question is it true or right? In other words, is what the person is saying, is it true? Is it right? And if it is, then what I need to do is profit from it. I need to grow from it. And so when we get criticized, a lot of times I find that even when I'm criticized by those who may be on the attack against me, there's usually a kernel of truth, or at least something that's right about it. And so what I want to do is profit from it and grow from it. You know, you can learn from almost any criticism that you take. You should at least evaluate what they're saying to make sure that it's something that you can deal with in terms of, is this a true thing? Is this a right thing? Now everybody who criticizes you doesn't mean they're right, because that leads to the second question you need to ask, and is it wrong? Is it false? And if it's not, then what do you need to do? You need to dismiss it. You can ignore it. But when we think about criticism, we say, okay, there's some truth here. There's something I can learn from here. I think that's an important way to go about it. And then also, I would even say, if it's true, you can look at it and say, I'm okay with being criticized about this. As a pastor, there's some things that I might get criticized about, or maybe Grace Point gets criticized about, and I would say I'm okay with that. It really is a confirmation that I'm on the right track because I get certain criticisms. And so that allows us to evaluate the criticism and say, you know what? I'm certainly okay with that type of criticism. You know, Jesus was okay with being criticized as being a friend to sinners and tax collectors. There are things that you can be criticized about and be okay with. It can help you firm up your convictions, so to speak. It can be a confirmation that the things that you are saying and doing are exactly the things that you want to be criticized about. I've discovered this. There will always be someone who has something critical to say about whatever you do. And so what really matters is the one person who is God who is concerned about the things that we say or do. And so when it comes to that, my goal is to please God, not to please men. And so if I'm pleasing God, I'm not overly concerned about what someone else thinks. But I also want to keep in mind what other people think, because I can grow and learn from it. So if it's not true and it's something that's false, you just let that go and dismiss it. Or you can also respond to it. And I think we get some instruction about that as well. There's an interesting couple of verses that are put together in Proverbs chapter 26, and they're one on top of the other. And one of them is that this is a time that you can speak up, and one time that you should shut up. And we all need to learn that at the right time for the apt response, so to speak, as when we should speak up and shut up. And so I want to read to you these two verses from Proverbs chapter 26 that says, first one says, "Answer not a fool according to his folly, lest you be like him yourself." In other words, so someone comes to you, and this describes him as a fool, and they say to you something that is critical. Your response would be, and probably emotional, would be to attack back. So they're on the attack, so you attack back. And so what it says is, in those moments, don't retaliate. Because if you retaliate, then the fool who's responding to you, who is, saying something to you, you respond back, you become just like the fool. So in that situation, you don't retaliate. But there's another situation where you can respond. There's a type of response that says, "Answer a fool according to his folly, lest he be wise in his own eyes." And so the response is for clarification. You want to help the other person understand why you said what you said, or why you did what you did, or why you didn't do something, or why you didn't say something. And so that is a response for clarification. I believe as believers that our response is never to be about retaliation, but is to be about clarification. And as we walk through this, we can begin to deal in our relationships so that we can grow through our criticism, and that we can push aside those things that are not helpful for us. There's an interesting story in the Old Testament where David is being pushed out of his kingdom. King David, the second king of Israel, is because his son Absalom has overthrown him. And so he's running basically for his life with a few of his people, some of his soldiers, and he's going out of town. And on the way out of town there's a guy named Shimei who ends up, he's throwing rocks and he's cursing David, not using curse words, but he actually is placing curses on David. And so he's yelling at him, basically calling David a dog, and so he's very critical of David. And in that moment, one of David's soldiers looks at him and says, "Hey, you want me to take my sword out and go cut off his head?" And this story is found in 2 Samuel 16. But David points out this situation and tells him no, not to attack this guy, and so not to retaliate for the things he said. He even leaves it in the Lord's hand. But one of the things that's interesting that David says, and I want to read to you, this is 2 Samuel chapter 16, verse 11. David says to Abishai, who's a soldier, and to all of his servants, "Behold, my own son seeks my life. How much more now this Benjaminite?" So this is a relative of Saul, who was the previous king. "Leave him alone, let him curse, for the Lord has told him to. And it may be that the Lord will look on the wrong done to me, and that the Lord will pay me with the good for his cursing today." And so what we discover with David is he's saying, I'm going to leave this in the hands of God. So he's getting criticized, but also he says, maybe this is a providential criticism. And that's the way that we need to look at criticism. Maybe the criticism that we get is providential, that God has allowed it to happen, whether it's true or false, so that we can spend some time looking at our life, looking at the things we do, the things that we say, and really evaluate those things. And so today, if you've been criticized, what would happen if you took some time to really begin to evaluate the criticism? I think it would help you if you could get to the place where you could look at it reasonably and not just emotionally. And that allows you to benefit from it. And then if it's not helpful, you just push it to the side and you let the Lord take care of it. Jesus was a master of doing this. Nobody was criticized probably as much as he was, but he learned when to speak up. He learned when to let the Lord fight his battles, and we must learn that as well. So my advice today is, when you get criticism, a really quick thing you can do is you can ask two questions, and that is this true or right? If it is, I'm going to profit from it. If it's wrong and if it's false, then I'm going to let it go. And at times, when it's the right time, I'll even seek to get clarification, but I'll never respond with retaliation. One place I want to point you to that has been really helpful for me over the years, and I've read this sermon over and over, is the great Charles Spurgeon wrote this sermon called The Blind Eye and the Deaf Ear. And it's in that sermon, man, I've learned a ton about how to deal with issues such as criticism, gossip, and the things that people say. And so I want to encourage you today, if you can go Google that and just put in Charles Spurgeon, Blind Eye, Deaf Ear, it'll take you right to that sermon. It's just a wealth of good information for you as you think through the issues when you've been criticized. My hope for you is that you would not get criticized, but if you do, that you would turn to the Lord's Word and that you would benefit from it. And when it's not of the Lord, that you would release it and dismiss it. And so may God's hand be on you. If you've got a question, we'd love for you to pose to us. So if you want to ask something like that's been asked today. Thank you for coming to Glad You Asked. If you've had a question that you'd like to be answered, if you could email that at info@gracepointchurch.org or maybe in the comments section, I would be glad to entertain your question. May God bless you.